The story of the quiet nervous system does not begin in a laboratory or a therapist's office, but in the flickering half-light of the world's first fires, when early humans huddled close to the warmth of burning wood and discovered, without naming it, that calm was something the body learned through rhythm. The crackle of flames, the steady breathing of a gathered tribe, the slow ebb of darkness around them, these were the earliest teachers of physiological peace, long before a word like parasympathetic existed. Archaeologists studying Paleolithic hearth circles have found soot patterns indicating that ancient people arranged themselves in concentric formations, suggesting not random gatherings, but intentional structuring, an early choreography of safety, where the nervous system, soothed by predictable human presence and steady sensory cues, could downshift from vigilance into something approaching quietude. And while no written record remains from those distant nights, the bones of early Homo sapiens often show lower levels of stress-related microfractures compared to their hunter-gatherer descendants in harsher climates, implying that the earliest human societies already understood instinctively how states of nervous calm could shape survival. As millennia unfolded, the idea of inner quiet began weaving itself into the mythic imagination. In ancient Mesopotamia, temple inscriptions described the goddess Nanshi calming the winds within the chest of supplicants, an early metaphor for what later civilizations would attempt to map anatomically. Meanwhile, the physicians of the Old Kingdom of Egypt carved on papyrus their observations of heart rhythms that changed with mood. They believed that a tiny invisible channel, the metu, carried emotional disturbances through the body, much like a river rising after a storm. Although incorrect by modern standards, their records show the first attempt to track the physiological shift between agitation and ease, hinting at an embryonic understanding of the nervous system's duality. The Greeks, inheriting fragments of Egyptian medical lore, propelled the inquiry further into the realm of philosophy and observation. Hippocrates noted that soldiers who practiced slow breathing before battle displayed fewer tremors than those who did not, writing that the breath is the charioteer of the mind. His student Diocles of Carystus emphasized that calm was not merely the absence of fear, but a trained bodily condition, one cultivated through regimen, temperature exposure, and diet. These early physicians lacked modern anatomical precision, but the language they used, winds, flows, humors, mirrored an intuitive grasp that the body possessed opposing states, one of tension and one of restoration, the latter being the ancient counterpart of what we now call the quiet nervous system.
Centuries later, as Rome expanded across continents, the empire's physicians brought Greek medical ideas into direct contact with battlefield realities. Galen, attending to gladiators who lived under constant threat of death, observed that certain fighters exhibited remarkable control over their trembling before combat. Intrigued, he documented their rituals, rhythmic tapping on shields, murmured recitations, slow pacing in tight circles. He believed these patterns stabilized what he termed the animal spirits, the mysterious currents that moved through the nerves. Though his theories were flawed, Galen's vast compendium preserved invaluable descriptions of how controlled behavior could shift physiological arousal, clues that modern science now interprets as early behavioral modulation of autonomic states. Meanwhile, halfway across the world, Chinese medical practitioners were articulating an even more elaborate vision of bodily balance. During the Warring States period, texts like the Huangdi Nijing detailed pathways, Jingluo, that we now understand loosely as metaphoric networks akin to nerves. They described how deep abdominal breathing anchored qi, enabling the body to return to a state of shu, or receptive quiet. Although qi does not correspond directly to any Western anatomical category, modern researchers examining Qigong masters find measurable shifts in heart rate variability, indicating activation of parasympathetic processes. The ancient Chinese, long before the concept of a vagus nerve was anatomically mapped, nevertheless recognized the restorative properties of slow, diaphragmatic breath, linking it to longevity, emotional stability, and strategic composure. In India, parallel traditions emerged. The Vedic hymns spoke of prana as a vital force, and early yogic practitioners developed pranayama techniques that modern physiologists now identify as precise manipulations of autonomic regulation. A remarkable bronze sculpture from the Kushan period depicts a seated ascetic with pronounced rib indents, suggesting mastery over controlled exhalation, a practice known today to increase vagal tone and soften sympathetic activation. When Patanjali later codified yoga, he articulated a principle modern neuroscience recognizes: that stillness of the body generates stillness of the mind. He was not speaking metaphorically. He was describing a sequence of physiological events that, though unmapped at the time, reflect. By the Renaissance, the study of the nervous system was transforming rapidly. Leonardo da Vinci's anatomical sketches reveal not only a visual genius, but an early attempt to map neural pathways with unprecedented accuracy. In one drawing, he traced the vagus nerve, though he did not yet know its name, from the brainstem through the thorax, noting its proximity to the heart. He speculated that this nerve played a role in the motions of breath and spirit, unknowingly identifying the very structure central to the modern quiet nervous system. A century later,
René Descartes proposed that the body operated through mechanical feedback loops, comparing nerves to hydraulic pipes. Though his model was reductive, it encouraged later anatomists to dissect nerves more precisely. Then came the electricity age of the 18th century. Luigi Galvani's experiments with frog legs twitching under electric currents revealed the electrochemical nature of nerve impulses. His wife, Lucia, reportedly noticed the first twitch during a storm, lightning striking a wire connected to a frog specimen. Their living room laboratory scene marked the beginning of electrophysiology, although neither knew that their discovery would one day illuminate how calm itself could be quantified through electrical activity in the heart, gut, and brain. As the Enlightenment expanded scientific curiosity, the industrial era accelerated it. Railway accidents in the 19th century revealed disturbing psychological after-effects, what physicians called railway spine, a precursor to modern trauma research. Charles Darwin, observing the freeze, flight, fight reactions of animals, proposed that emotional expressions were inherited survival mechanisms, hinting at the deep evolutionary roots of autonomic states. He also wrote that slow stroking calmed mammals because it imitated the grooming patterns of social species, reflections that modern neuroscience now interprets as insights into tactile regulation of the vagus nerve. Meanwhile, physicians such as Claude Bernard made breakthroughs that directly foreshadowed the concept of the quiet nervous system. Bernard identified the milieu intérieur, the internal environment of the body that remained stable despite external changes. He believed this stability depended on delicate neural balances, several of which he traced to a major nerve he called the pneumogastric, today recognized as the vagus nerve. His work inspired generations of physiologists who would later distinguish the sympathetic and parasympathetic systems as competing yet complementary forces governing survival and restoration. By the early 20th century, the pieces of the modern puzzle were falling into place. Walter Cannon's research on adrenaline revealed how the body mobilized for threat, coining the term fight or flight. But Cannon also noted that after danger passed, a counter-process restored equilibrium, though he left that second branch of the puzzle less explored. Soon after, Otto Loewy's famous dream-inspired experiment demonstrated that neurons communicated chemically, not just electrically. When he stimulated a frog's vagus nerve, its heart slowed. At the same time, Sigmund Freud, trained originally as a neurologist, observed that certain trauma responses involved overwhelming activation followed by numbing collapse. Although psychoanalytic theory would later drift into abstraction, Freud's early neurological writings recognized distinct bodily states corresponding to defense, agitation, and quiet restoration. His collaborator, Joseph Breuer, noted that slow exhalation could reduce hysteria symptoms in some patients, hinting again at the ancient intuition that breath was a gateway to calm. World War I, with its unprecedented mechanized terror, forced scientific attention on the nervous system's extremes. Soldiers suffering from shell shock displayed symptoms that defied existing medical categories: trembling, dissociation, muteness. Military physicians documented that some soldiers recovered more quickly when placed in quiet gardens away from artillery noise, suggesting that sensory gentleness helped reactivate the body's restorative circuits. Though researchers of the time lacked the vocabulary of parasympathetic tone, their detailed field notes now read like early case studies of autonomic dysregulation and repair. The interwar years saw the rise of experimental psychology. Ivan Pavlov, famous for his salivating dogs, also discovered that animals exposed to prolonged stress entered a torpid, shut-down-like state he called transmarginal inhibition. His laboratory notebooks describe dogs who, after a chaotic stimulus, stopped reacting entirely, a phenomenon modern researchers now connect to dorsal vagal activation, the least understood component of the quiet nervous system's opposite pole. Pavlov did not interpret it as a functional survival response, but his meticulous documentation preserved a crucial piece of the autonomic puzzle. Then World War II erupted, shattering global stability and generating new waves of nervous system research, not for curiosity, but necessity. Flight surgeons studying pilot endurance realized that breathing patterns determined not only oxygen intake, but cognitive clarity under pressure. They observed that pilots who extended their exhales were less likely to panic during rapid altitude changes. Meanwhile, neuroscientists studying prisoners of war noted that rhythmic collective chanting in camps sometimes protected individuals from psychological collapse, indicating that synchronized sound could stabilize the autonomic system even in dire conditions.
Around the same time, biomedical researchers developed early electrocardiographs, enabling the measurement of heart rate variability. They noticed that certain breathing rhythms produced smoother variability curves, an indicator now associated with parasympathetic activation. In quiet hospital basements, researchers observed that patients listening to slow string compositions showed more pronounced oscillations in vagal modulation, though they lacked the vocabulary to explain why certain frequencies soothe the body more effectively than others. By the late 20th century, the modern conceptualization of the quiet nervous system was only missing one piece: an integrative framework uniting physiology, psychology, evolution, and social behavior. That piece would emerge from an unexpected intersection of developmental research and neuroanatomy, shaping the contemporary understanding that calm was not merely a physical condition, but a relational state rooted in millions of years of mammalian bonding. The push toward this integrative understanding began quietly, in neonatal wards,
where physicians noticed that premature infants, though fragile, stabilized more rapidly when pressed skin to skin against a caregiver's chest. These observations, systematically recorded in hospitals from Bogota to Stockholm during the 1970s, challenged prevailing assumptions that such infants needed mechanical isolation. Instead, doctors found that the warmth, scent, and rhythmic heartbeat of another human produced measurable shifts in the infant's breathing, digestion, and muscle tone. This clinical pattern echoed something ancient, the body restoring itself through proximity, touch, and the predictable sensory cues of safety. Researchers collecting these data did not yet frame it as autonomic regulation, but they meticulously documented the cascade of physiological changes, quieting of limbs, deepening breaths, stabilization of heart rhythms that today are recognized as markers of parasympathetic activation. The phenomenon suggested that calm was not solely an internal achievement, but a biological duet born from millions of years of mammalian attachment behavior. Around the same time, anthropologists studying high-altitude communities in Nepal and Peru were puzzled by the same principle emerging in radically different conditions. Observing herding families who lived among thin air and harsh winds, they noted that long storytelling rituals conducted around hearths were almost always accompanied by slow weaving, rhythmic tapping, or repetitive hand motions. Gerontologists interviewing elders found that these gestures, passed down unconsciously, helped steady breathing in environments where oxygen scarcity triggered sympathetic arousal.
Meanwhile, in Europe, trauma research evolved out of grim necessity. Holocaust survivors participating in psychological studies recounted paradoxical responses to safety, moments when calm settings provoked panic rather than relief. Neurologists sought explanations, conducting early EEG recordings that revealed irregularities in brainwave patterns near the brainstem. While their equipment lacked precision, these experiments hinted that trauma reconfigured the body's capacity to access calm states, suggesting that the nervous system possessed a kind of memory, one that could be shaped by terror and soothed only through very specific forms of sensory and relational input. Over time, detailed case notes accumulated, documenting how survivors found ease not through abstract reassurance, but through steady physical anchors, slow rocking, low monotonous sounds, gentle pressure across the shoulders. These observations laid the groundwork for later theories that safety was not cognitive but embodied, dependent on the nervous system's ability to detect predictable patterns. The late 20th century brought a technological leap that transformed these scattered observations into measurable science. Functional MRI machines, emerging in the 1800s and 1900s, allowed researchers to observe neural activation in real time. When volunteers practiced slow breathing inside these humming metallic tunnels, the scan results revealed a dance of activity shifting from the amygdala toward brain regions associated with social engagement and calm. What startled scientists was the role of the vagus nerve, firing in patterns that synchronized the heart, lungs, and facial muscles, enabling expressions of softness and connection. Neuroscientists realized that the same systems supporting calm also orchestrated facial cues, vocal tone, and even the subtle tilt of the head when listening, integrating physiology and communication in a single adaptive network. These discoveries built upon earlier electrophysiology but extended far beyond it, revealing that the quiet nervous system was not a passive state, but a sophisticated mode of being oriented toward connection, learning, and restoration. In laboratories across California and Europe, researchers studying primate behavior uncovered parallel findings. Observing rhesus macaques, they noted that grooming not only removed parasites, but also produced profound shifts in group dynamics. Subordinate monkeys who received frequent grooming displayed lower cortisol levels and were less likely to react aggressively to minor provocations. Biologists analyzing blood samples found increased levels of endogenous opioids, suggesting an ancient biochemical loop between touch, trust, and calm. The macaque's soft coos and rhythmic stroking activated pathways similar to those identified in humans practicing mindful breathing or chanting, pointing toward a cross-species pattern. Safety arises through predictability and connection, mediated by neural circuits refined over millions of social evolution.
Parallel research emerged from an unexpected field: musicology. Ethnomusicologists recording lullabies across cultures discovered that despite vast differences in scale and rhythm, most lullabies share three features: a narrow melodic range, slow tempo, and consistent repetition. When neuroscientists later played these recordings to adults in controlled experiments, subjects displayed increased parasympathetic activation, regardless of whether they understood the lyrics or recognized the culture of origin. This universality suggested that certain acoustic patterns were so deeply entwined with human caregiving behaviors that they triggered innate physiological responses. Some researchers hypothesized that these melodies originated as vocal extensions of the heartbeat itself, a theory supported by findings that the tempo of most lullabies corresponds to the relaxed pulse of an adult human. The idea that calm could be transmitted through sound alone underscored a profound truth. The quiet nervous system listens for cues of safety long before the conscious mind interprets them. As these interdisciplinary discoveries accumulated, a new generation of clinicians began to merge them with therapeutic practice. Somatic therapists in the 1980s and 90s observed that trauma patients often regained stability not through insight, but through micro-movements, subtle tremors, slow stretches, shifts in posture that released tension stored in the musculature. These practitioners proposed that the nervous system possessed a self-repair mechanism encoded in the body's natural movements,
akin to the shaking observed in animals after escaping predators. Zoologists studying antelope and hares had documented similar phenomena. After a chase, surviving animals would tremble violently for several minutes before resuming normal grazing. These full-body tremors, though dramatic, signaled the reactivation of the parasympathetic system, an instinctive reset that humans, due to social conditioning, often suppressed. Therapists began teaching patients to allow such tremors, discovering that doing so restored the capacity to access calm more reliably than cognitive reframing alone. Meanwhile, historians tracing battlefield medicine stumbled upon surprising parallels. Diaries of soldiers from the Napoleonic Wars to Vietnam recounted moments of inexplicable calm amidst chaos, states described as the stillness, the pause, or the brass silence. Military physicians noted that soldiers trained in synchronized marching or cadence chanting often entered combat with more regulated breathing, exhibiting fewer symptoms of panic in the first minutes of engagement. Though these rituals were intended for discipline and morale, they inadvertently activated parasympathetic pathways through rhythmic movement and collective vocalization. Throughout history, from Roman legions chanting before battle to Mongol riders singing across the steppe, war and quietude intertwined in unexpected patterns. Where survival demanded split-second reactions, humanity had instinctively evolved rituals that steadied the nervous system before the storm. In the civilian realm, researchers investigating urbanization uncovered another dimension of the quiet nervous system. Sociologists studying post-industrial cities realized that chronic exposure to unpredictable noise, sirens, engines, alarms, elevated sympathetic activation among residents, resulting in higher rates of hypertension and sleep disruption. Yet within these same cities, pockets of calm persisted. Libraries, public baths, botanical gardens. Early 20th century urban planners, although unaware of neurobiology, intuitively designed these spaces to counterbalance industrial overstimulation. When modern neuroscientists placed sensors on volunteers walking through different environments, they found that time spent among plants, water, or architecturally symmetrical spaces produced immediate shifts toward parasympathetic dominance. Japanese researchers later formalized this with Shinrin-yoku, or forest bathing, demonstrating that immersion in natural settings activated pathways associated with restoration and immune function. By the start of the 21st century, the convergence of neurobiology, anthropology, psychology, and evolutionary theory painted a picture more intricate than any single discipline could have assembled. The quiet nervous system was no longer seen as an optional luxury, but as a biologically essential state intertwined with everything from digestion to social trust. Yet its historical roots stretched far deeper than modern scanners could reveal. Reaching back through centuries of cultural rituals, survival strategies,
and ancestral wisdom. As new research continued to surface, scholars realized that no era had been untouched by humanity's quest to understand calm, not as an abstract emotional preference, but as a force governing the rhythms of civilization itself. And still, the narrative continued to unfold, drawing the lens closer to the present moment, where technological acceleration and ancient biology collided in ways previous generations could scarcely imagine. With each new discovery, the story of the quiet nervous system expanded, revealing not only the science of calm, but the long historical arc through which humanity learned, forgot, rediscovered, and refined the methods by which the body returns to peace. As the new millennium unfolded, researchers confronted a paradox. Never before had human beings possessed so much knowledge about the nervous system, and yet modern life seemed designed to provoke constant sympathetic activation. The rise of always-on digital technologies created a world where vigilance was rewarded and rest was treated as inefficiency. Emails pinged at midnight, smartphones vibrated on bedside tables, and social networks engineered intermittent bursts of novelty that kept the brain on edge. Neuroscientists studying early smartphone users noticed microsurges of cortisol each time a notification chimed, subtle enough to go unnoticed, but cumulative over months and years. Gradually, the body learned to expect interruptions. While the problem grew more visible, an unlikely group of scholars began offering new insights. Historians of science examining forgotten medical archives. One such archive, discovered in the basement of a nearly abandoned Viennese hospital, contained hundreds of handwritten case notes from early 20th century physicians who had experimented with quiet therapy for patients with neurasthenia. They described treatment rooms lined with cork insulation to muffle sound, neutral paint tones to minimize visual stimulation, and chaise longues designed to support the spine without inducing muscular tension. Their rationale was crude, but their recordings of patients' responses fascinated modern analysts. Lowered pulse rates, smoother digestion, and decreased muscular rigidity. These forgotten experiments, long overshadowed by the rise of psychoanalysis, revealed that earlier generations had recognized the physiological dimensions of quiet long before modern terminology existed. Meanwhile, in Scandinavia, sociologists studying communal living traditions uncovered another thread in the long history of calm. In some Norwegian fishing villages, families maintained centuries-old rituals before embarking on dangerous winter voyages. Slow collective meals, extended silences, and synchronized prayer recitations conducted in near darkness. These rituals, performed on the eve of risk, were not simply spiritual gestures. They modulated the autonomic states of entire communities. Oral histories recorded by ethnographers described how the stillness of these evenings sharpened focus, steadied hands, and prevented panic during storms at sea. When physiologists later interviewed surviving members of these communities, they documented distinctive breathing patterns passed down across generations, long descending exhalations used instinctively during moments of fear. The researchers concluded that these traditions served as intergenerational repositories of nervous system knowledge, preserved through ritual rather than science. Across the world, in the rainforests of central Borneo, anthropologists working with the Penan people noticed a parallel phenomenon. Nomadic hunters moved with deliberate slowness during tracking, not merely for stealth, but to regulate their inner state. One elder explained that the forest hears fast hearts, a poetic description aligning with modern findings that elevated heart rate alters sensory perception and decision-making. Further study revealed that Penan hunters used soft-whistled melodies before pursuing game, evoking a calm that sharpened attention. The melodies shared acoustic qualities with lullabies, reinforcing the cross-cultural pattern in which certain sound structures shaped autonomic states. The Penon's deep listening practices, developed over centuries of intimate environmental knowledge, embodied a refined understanding of how inner quiet enhanced survival. At the same moment, in the concrete corridors of high-tech research centers, scientists mapped the neural basis of calm with increasing precision. Using diffusion tensor imaging, they traced the pathways of the vagus nerve with unprecedented clarity, revealing its vast sensory dominance. Roughly 80% of its fibers carried messages from the body to the brain, not the other way around. This discovery reframed earlier assumptions. Calm was not something the mind instructed the body to feel. It was something the body reported to the brain through a steady stream of sensory cues. Soft muscle tone, warm skin temperature, rhythmic breath, the absence of threat signals. Once these cues reached the brainstem, they cascaded upward into emotional and cognitive circuits, producing the lived experience of safety. This bottom-up architecture explained why logical reassurance rarely quelled fear, and why practices grounded in sensation, breathing, touch, and movement had historically been more reliable tools for accessing quiet. But the most transformative insights came from developmental neuroscience. Researchers studying infant caregiver interactions demonstrated that the quiet nervous system developed not through instruction, but through attunement. When caregivers responded to a baby's distress with consistent timing, tone, and touch, the child's autonomic circuits mapped predictability into their physiological vocabulary. Over time, this predictability formed the basis for self-regulation, allowing the child to calm without external help. Conversely, inconsistent or chaotic caregiving created nervous systems tuned to hypervigilance. These findings, while modern in methodology, echoed ancient intuitions found in medieval midwifery manuals and indigenous child-rearing traditions across the world, which emphasized rhythmic rocking, skin-to-skin holding, and melodic vocalization. The continuity across centuries suggested that the blueprint for quiet was ancient, biological, and universal. New research also illuminated the profound interplay between breath and emotion. Using ultra-sensitive respiratory sensors, scientists discovered that human beings altered their breathing patterns not only in response to emotions, but in anticipation of them. Actors trained in classical theater, particularly within the traditions of Greek tragedy revival, used exaggerated breath cycles to enter emotional states before speaking lines, techniques passed down from stage to stage without conscious physiological knowledge. When neuroscientists analyzed these techniques, they found that specific breathing rhythms produced predictable shifts in heart rate variability and vagal activation, effectively tuning the nervous system like an instrument. This link between breath and emotion, evident in the chants of Tibetan monks, the hymns of medieval cloisters, and the work songs of 19th century laborers, now gained scientific validation.
Meanwhile, global surveys revealed striking differences in how cultures structured daily opportunities for calm. Japanese architecture, rooted in centuries-old design principles, emphasized negative space, soft light, and natural materials, elements that modern researchers tied to parasympathetic dominance. In contrast, rapidly developing cities designed for efficiency and economic density often generated environments of constant, low-grade stress. When urban designers in Singapore conducted experiments introducing pockets of intentional quiet, water features, shaded walkways, curved garden paths, they recorded measurable reductions in sympathetic arousal among pedestrians wearing biometric monitors. These findings influenced a new movement in city planning, designing urban ecosystems around the biological requirements of the nervous system, rather than treating calm as an afterthought. In parallel, historians of religion uncovered early contemplative traditions whose physiological sophistication had long been overlooked. Monastic orders in the Sinai Desert recorded breathing instructions nearly identical to techniques now used in clinical settings. Manuscripts from the 6th century described the prayer of stillness, practiced with a slow inward gaze and gentle contraction of the throat, resembling modern ujjayi breathing. Medieval Sufi poets composed verses that doubled as pacing guides for breath-regulated chant, embedding physiological regulation within spiritual devotion. Buddhist monks in Tang Dynasty China practiced nembutsu recitations with cadences that modern audio analysis revealed to be precisely aligned with a 6-second exhalation pattern. Across continents, spiritual seekers had discovered through practice the pathways modern neuroscience would later quantify. Just as these historical insights gained recognition, a new frontier emerged in the study of the gut-brain axis. Researchers unlocked the role of the enteric nervous system, the second brain, in shaping the quiet state. They learned that certain microbial populations encouraged the production of neurotransmitters associated with calm, including serotonin and GABA. These discoveries reframed historical medical traditions that linked digestion to tranquility. Medieval Persian physicians, for example, emphasized warm soups and fermented dairy as remedies for agitation. Ancient Roman texts recommended sourdough and herbal bitter wines for restoring inner equilibrium. Without modern microbiology, they had nevertheless identified nutritional patterns that supported parasympathetic function. Scientists pushed further, charting how inflammation disrupted autonomic regulation. Chronic inflammatory states, even mild ones, activated pathways that signaled danger to the brain, making calm biologically harder to reach. With this knowledge, historians revisited accounts of medieval fasting rituals and monastic diets, discovering that many were inadvertently anti-inflammatory. What earlier scholars had interpreted solely as spiritual discipline now appeared to contain layers of physiological strategy. Even the daily structure of monastic life, periods of work, silence, chant, and rest, resembled a meticulously crafted rhythm optimized for autonomic stability.
By the mid-2010s, the scientific, historical, and cultural threads had converged to reveal an extraordinary tapestry. Humanity had been studying, preserving, losing, rediscovering, and refining the pathways to quiet for at least 10,000 years. Each discovery illuminated another facet of a system far more intricate than the simple stress versus calm dichotomy once taught in textbooks. The quiet nervous system emerged as a dynamic, adaptive state rooted in rhythm, relationship, breath, environment, nutrition, culture, memory, and biological architecture. And as researchers continued their work, they found that understanding calm was not simply a matter of science, but a deep excavation into the history of what it meant to be human. As scientific understanding deepened, attention turned toward communities whose nervous systems seemed unusually resilient despite harsh environments. In the high plateaus of northern Kenya, researchers studying the Samburu people noticed that long-distance herders displayed remarkably stable heart rate patterns, even during strenuous treks across arid plains. Intrigued, anthropologists investigated the daily routines of these herders and discovered a sequence of quiet practices embedded seamlessly into their movements: steady humming during sunrise departures, rhythmic staff tapping while walking, and deliberate stillness during midday heat. None of these behaviors were framed as health techniques. They were inherited traditions, developed over generations of adapting to landscapes where unpredictability could become fatal. When biometric sensors captured the herder's physiology, a distinct pattern emerged. Moments of intense exertion were balanced by micro-intervals of calm, allowing the nervous system to oscillate smoothly rather than remaining locked in sympathetic drive. This fluid regulation allowed the Samburu to endure conditions that would overwhelm most modern nervous systems, demonstrating that resilience came not from suppressing stress, but from rhythmic recovery woven into daily life. Meanwhile, historians of technology examined how industrialization reshaped human autonomic patterns on a global scale. The introduction of mechanized looms in the 18th century textile factories created auditory environments of relentless clatter that early factory workers described as nerve-shaking. Diaries from Lancashire mill workers detailed symptoms that modern clinicians recognize as chronic sympathetic activation: insomnia, trembling, digestive distress, conditions that spread rapidly as mechanization intensified. Yet some factories implemented curious countermeasures, scheduled silent minutes during which all machinery paused. Managers introduced these breaks to improve concentration and reduce accidents, but they inadvertently provided workers with brief opportunities to reset their autonomic balance. Reports from the time note reduced error rates immediately following these silent intervals, a historical echo of what modern neuroscience confirms: that even short returns to quiet can recalibrate the nervous system.
In East Asia, scholars turned to classical literature for clues about traditional approaches to calm. Tang Dynasty poetry, rich with references to still ponds, bamboo groves, and distant mountain bells, was long interpreted purely through aesthetic lenses. But literary historians collaborating with neuroscientists began analyzing these poems as sensory maps. They noted that the environments described, low noise, balanced visual complexity, gentle motion, aligned with modern findings about restorative landscapes. The famous empty pavilion motif found throughout Chinese painting not only symbolized philosophical openness, but also reflected a profound environmental insight. Humans are calmed by spaces that offer both refuge and vista, a combination that signals safety in evolutionary terms. Artists of the time, without anatomical knowledge, instinctively expressed the contours of the quiet nervous system through brushstrokes and verse. Across the Himalayas, Tibetan scholars preserved breathing practices refined over centuries. During field visits to remote monasteries, researchers witnessed rituals performed in unbroken sequences lasting hours, guided by slow chants whose frequencies created gentle vibrations in the chest. When monks participated in modern physiological studies, they demonstrated exceptional control over autonomic functions. Some could lower their heart rates to levels seen in deep sleep while maintaining full alertness, challenging assumptions about the limits of human regulation. Their techniques, transmitted through oral lineage rather than scientific documentation, represented a parallel knowledge system, one built from observation, ritual refinement, and generational memory. These findings inspired new research into the plasticity of the vagus nerve and the extent to which deliberate practice could reshape its responsiveness. In the Mediterranean, archaeologists excavating the ruins of ancient healing sanctuaries known as Asclepia uncovered architectural designs that appeared tailored for nervous system restoration. Pathways curved gently rather than abruptly, guiding pilgrims through progressively quieter spaces as they approached the inner chambers. Pools of still water reflected filtered sunlight, creating patterns that shifted slowly across walls in a rhythmic tempo. Stone inscriptions suggested that patients slept within the sanctuaries, not merely for spiritual dreams, but because rest itself was considered integral to healing. When architects reconstructed these spaces digitally, acoustic modeling revealed that the sanctuaries muted sharp sounds while amplifying soft, continuous ones, conditions ideal for parasympathetic activation. Far from primitive superstition, these structures embodied an empirical understanding of environmental calm encoded into ancient architecture.
In South America, archaeobotanists studying Andean civilizations uncovered traces of plants historically used to induce serenity. While some held psychoactive properties, others simply supported digestion or reduced inflammation, indirectly promoting autonomic balance. The Moche people cultivated a tea-like infusion from a little-known flower that modern chemical analysis revealed to contain compounds influencing gut-brain communication. Though the Moche had no concept of neurotransmitters, they recognized that certain plants quieted the belly storms associated with fear. Their pottery, painted with swirling motifs around the abdomen, depicted emotional states as visceral movements, visual metaphors that align remarkably with the modern understanding of the enteric nervous system. As global research intensified, another unexpected field stepped into relevance: environmental acoustics. Experts studying ocean habitats noticed that whales exposed to human sonar exhibited patterns of stress parallel to those found in urban humans overwhelmed by noise pollution. When sonar activity paused during an international moratorium, whales resumed complex social songs almost immediately, reflecting a nervous system recovering from chronic auditory assault. These findings reshaped conversations about human environments. If marine mammals required predictable acoustic landscapes to maintain social cohesion, what of humans living in cities saturated with alarms, engines, and electronic notifications? Scientists began mapping acoustic ecology alongside public health, reinforcing the idea that calm was a multi-sensory condition dependent on the quality of the surrounding world. Even the field of linguistics contributed unexpected insights. Researchers comparing languages found that those with tonal softness or elongated vowels, such as Hawaiian, Maori, and certain Finno-Ugaric dialects, often originated in cultures with strong communal traditions and emphases on harmonious living. While causation remained elusive, early hypotheses suggested that the acoustic properties of language itself might shape social nervous system dynamics. Certain phonetic features, repeated across generations, could subtly entrain calm through vocal resonance. This theory gained traction when speech scientists observed that reading poetry from these languages, even without understanding the meaning, lowered sympathetic markers in listeners. The human voice, shaped by culture, appeared capable of carrying patterns of regulation through time. Meanwhile, in laboratories equipped with increasingly sensitive imaging tools, scientists investigated how memory intertwined with autonomic states. They discovered that experiences of safety left physiological imprints, creating neural pathways that made future calm easier to access. These traces of quiet accumulated through repeated exposure to predictable, soothing conditions. Conversely, environments of chaos or threat created patterns that made calm more elusive. This duality provided a biological explanation for generational stories about homes built around evening rituals, songs sung at dusk, or seasonal observances designed to mark transitions with predictability. Across cultures, humanity had long cultivated traditions that transmitted not only identity, but also nervous system literacy.
In remote corners of Siberia, ethnographers studying the Evenki reindeer herders documented practices that blended stillness with motion in striking ways. During migrations across frozen landscapes, Evenki guides maintained a slow, rolling gait synchronized with the reindeer's rhythmic steps. This entrainment, they explained, allowed them to sense subtle shifts in the herd's emotional state, an attunement possible only when their own bodies were calm. The Evenki described this state as the listening body, a phrase resonating with modern theories of interoception, the brain's awareness of internal sensations. Their embodied knowledge suggested a deep intuition that to perceive the world accurately, one must first quiet the internal storms. As global attention shifted toward mental health crises, the rising prevalence of anxiety illuminated just how disconnected many had become from the rhythms supporting autonomic balance. Clinicians revisiting ancient texts found relevance in places once dismissed as mystical. The Egyptian Book of Breathing, long interpreted as a funerary document, contained detailed instructions for breath control that modern scholars reclassified as meditative techniques. In Greece, fragments of Stoic writings described measured breath for measured thought, aligning philosophical discipline with physiological practice. Even medieval Jewish texts, including sections of the Hasidei Ashkenazi writings, referenced breath as a conduit for spiritual clarity, evidence that the foundation of calm transcended geographical, linguistic, and temporal boundaries. New frontiers emerged in the study of human touch. Behavioral scientists observed that certain forms of touch, slow strokes along the forearm at a specific speed, activated specialized nerve fibers known as C-tactile afferents. These fibers sent signals directly to brain regions associated with emotional regulation, bypassing pathways linked to analytical thought. This discovery explained why gestures such as swaddling infants, gentle massage, or holding hands had persisted across millennia as universal tools of reassurance. It also shed light on historical customs.